Welcome to our first academic afternoon after the summer break. I hope that we will even get more people into the room, given the importance of the topic we're going to cover today. We have also colleagues in Luke and Bedfordshire who will be able to see the event through a streaming device. And I think Roberto, one of our speakers, has also invited a few people out there to actually listen in to the session today. So I guess with the session today, we're going to explore a very, very important topic close to the heart of our day-to-day practice as psychiatrists. And I guess that far too rarely we really have an opportunity to explore these topics, given that we are very often faced with ethical challenges in our work. So I'm really pleased that we today have a range of international expert speakers who will help us to actually explore this topic. And for those of you who tend to actually leave the room after the break, I can only really highly recommend not to do so today, because you're in for two really important presentations after the break, really giving us examples as to how practice could potentially look like if we radically kind of reconsider some of our practices. I'm very pleased to actually chair the session today with my ex-colleague, Martin Zinkler, and Martin will actually chair the first half of the meeting. So over to you, Martin.
Right, thank you very much, Frank, and I hope I'm understood even in the virtual room. Otherwise, those in the virtual room need to make up their mind if it's not loud enough, or if it's too German, for that matter. So I'm Martin Zinkler, a psychiatrist. I've worked with Frank, and I've been to quite a few academic afternoons at the time, but that's a little while ago. And so I don't go on for long because I'll have a presentation later on anyway. But I have the pleasure of introducing to you Fabian Freienhagen. Fabian is a philosopher. He's also a professor of philosophy at the University of Essex, and he got into the topic of mental health and human rights by working with the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex, but he also started an autonomy project, and he is quite well read and has published extensively on the Frankfurt School. And so I'll be really curious and keen to hear what you have to say, Fabian. Over to you.
Hi, can you hear me at the back? Hey, great. So, there's a clicker. Is there a clicker? No.
Probably best take the mouse.
Okay. So, I'm here today to talk about human rights, autonomy, and coercion. As Martin said, I'm a philosopher by training, so I'm going to talk about some sort of high-level value and philosophical issues, and then we'll get closer to the practice as we go along. But I hope what I have to say is still relevant for you in your practice. So I want to start with the headline news, which I think is relevant to you. Some of you will know this already, but perhaps not all. On the contrary, contemporary understanding of human rights, what you're doing in psychiatry in terms of coercion is in violation of human rights. That might surprise you. Perhaps people have heard this already in the room. But you might even think, so much the worse for human rights, contemporary, if they think that. They've clearly got it wrong. I don't necessarily want to defend that view. I want to today give you the rationale, the background rationale, why contemporary human rights think of coercion in psychiatry as a violation of human rights. It's not obvious, I think, why one might think that. And I still want to give you a bit about that rationale. And then I think once we see that rationale, I want to suggest that actually it has much more important, perhaps, I don't know, but much more wider implications, not just for psychiatry, but for society as a whole. So that's what I want to get to. Okay, now you might think, given that I had an interest in autonomy, and that's in the title, that autonomy is the deeper rationale why contemporary human rights doctrine thinks that coercion in psychiatry is wrong. You might think autonomy is the rationale. I want to suggest in the next few minutes that it's not. I find that surprising, but it's not. But I'd say a little bit about autonomy and why it's not the underlying rationale, because autonomy, surprisingly, is quite compatible with coercing people. That is quite surprising, and I will tell you a little bit about why that is in a moment. Then I want to introduce you the actual rationale which is behind this human rights doctrine, and that is a particular conception of liberty, which is often called Republican freedom. If you haven't heard of it before, don't worry, I will explain. That's the underlying rationale. And once we understood that underlying rationale, I want to suggest that achieving that will mean not just stopping coercion on psychiatric wards, but actually will require much wider democratic control about what even counts as a mental disorder and what we do about it as a society. So I want to say, first of all, it might be surprising that what you're doing coercively with patients on wards and is in violation of human rights. I want to say, well, the surprising thing is if we follow that train of thought, much more wider radical changes are here to come. And I want you to find out about it here first. Okay, so why one might think that autonomy is the rationale as a protection against coercion? Well, the reason for that is that often we think of autonomy as a kind of shield, which protects us from paternalistic intervention by others, and often particularly coercive intervention by the state. So we might think of autonomy as that sort of shield. Now, in the next 5-10 minutes, I want to suggest that that's not the shield the human rights doctrine has mainly in mind. But before I get to that, let me explain a bit more what I mean with autonomy in the first place. That would be a talk in its own right, so I'm going to be giving you a very, very, very brief history of the idea of autonomy. So let's start at the beginning. Autonomy is a term from ancient Greek, autonomia. It is a compound of two things, autos meaning self, and nomos meaning law. So autonomy is the idea that we give ourselves our own law. We self-govern. We determine by which principles we live our lives. Interestingly, in the ancient Greek context, autonomia was mainly applied to city-state, to policies. It was mainly to do about questions of political autonomy. Like we might think about Scotland having political autonomy from Westminster. That's the sort of notion which in the Greek, ancient Greek world was mainly at play when people talked about autonomy. There's a question whether Syracuse, as a colony of Corinth, can decide certain things on its own or always has to ask Corinth. That was the main use. But then interestingly, there's the first time in the ancient Greek language, as far as we know, that autonomia is used of an individual, is attributed to an individual. The first instance, as far as we know, is in Sophocles' play Antigone. I won't remind you of the play Antigone, you will probably know it. Antigone is this figure who defies the authorities of her city and of her town, goes against the norms of her city and town to bury her brother, who has died in a brutal civil war, and then as a consequence, after long back and forth, gets condemned to death by Creon, the ruler, who really doesn't tolerate the idea that someone breaks the rules of his city. And at the moment when Antigone goes to her own death, at that moment, Sophocles has the chorus sing that Antigone is the only one who is autonomous. It's the first use of autonomy of an individual, that she has given herself her own law in defiance of the laws of a city, and that makes her autonomous. And how does it end? Tragically. She's condemned to death, she dies. So autonomy is quite associated with tragedy, with tragic endings. Now, that still sort of echoes through history and still with us today. So think of a particular English context where people talk about autonomy. Mill used the word liberty, but people nowadays think he was mainly talking about autonomy. Mill famously said, and you probably all know this, the harm principle, the only purpose for which power, state power, can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will or her will is to prevent harm to others. So the state can't force me to do certain things for my own good. It can only force me to do certain things which prevents harm to others. Here's this idea of autonomy as a shield. Autonomy, if I have autonomy, as Mill would think, then the state can't force me to do certain things which are in my own good. Now, Mill has this famous example. Imagine you see someone walking towards a frail, broken bridge. And you know that if they're going to cross that bridge, they're going to die. Mill says, are you allowed to stop them? Answer, no. You're allowed to inform them that the bridge is broken and they're likely going to die if they try to cross it, but you're not allowed to stop them for their own good. If it is to prevent harm to others, you can stop them, but not for their own good. So what's Mill's take on the MHA? Mill's take is that perhaps the MHA is fine as a piece of legislation when it comes to the risk to others, but it's not fine when it comes to the risk to self. So there's a first sort of chink in the armor of something like the MHA. But as it turns out, autonomy isn't the real argument. I want to say one more thing about autonomy. In common law in England, there's still this sort of echo of Antigone. It's a famous judgment, you might have heard of it, by Lady Justice Butler Sloss, who said a mentally competent patient has an absolute right to refuse to consent to medical treatment for any reason, rational or irrational, or for no reason at all. This is really Mill at its best, channeled in English law. You can do it for any reason, for any whim. As far as your own safety is concerned, you can do it for any whim, even where that decision may lead to his or her own death. So again, we have an echo of Antigone here. You have an absolute right to refuse treatment, even if it leads to your own death, even if, like Antigone, you die at the end. And most of you are familiar with the later issued Mental Capacity Act. You find similar sort of ideas. As long as you have mental capacity, you can refuse treatment, even if they're unwise, if that's an unwise decision and leads to your death. Now, it sounds like autonomy is the shield, no, against coercion. Doesn't it sound like that? Well, no, it's not. It's not the underlying rationale why human rights doctrine now thinks that psychiatric coercion violates human rights. Why is that? I think no one says it like this, but I think underlying the background, which I'm trying to reconstruct here, is the following. Autonomy is a threshold concept. Now this, I mean, it's something which you have to have certain capacities. If you have these capacities, then you're said to be autonomous. If it's a threshold concept where you have to meet these capacities, then that means you can temporarily or permanently fall below the threshold. And then current law and a lot of philosophical doctrine of the past means that coercion is now compatible with autonomy. Think of the cases I was talking about. Think of this amazing bit of rhetoric by Butler Sloss, talking about absolute right to refuse treatment. Well, just look at it. If you're mentally competent, you have an absolute right. So there's a door here for someone to say, no, you're not mentally competent, so we can do something coercively to you, even if you don't want to. Similarly, Mill has this phrase, it's perhaps hardly necessary to say that this doctrine, the harm principle, is meant to apply only to human beings in the maturity of the faculty. That's sort of similar to the idea of mentally competent. And the Mental Capacity Act is similarly organized that you need to meet the threshold of mental capacity to understand and retain the relevant information, to be able to use and weigh that information and communicate it. And if a judge, for example, finds you to lack that, then they can do quite a lot coercively to you. One case is Re-E from 2012, where someone with anorexia, or presenting with anorexia, it was decided, well, under the Mental Capacity Act, not under the Mental Health Act, that this person should be force-fed for up to 2 years against her will, because she was considered not to have mental capacity to decide about food intake. So these sort of examples suggest to me that autonomy is quite compatible with quite a lot of coercion. And hence, surprisingly, it's not the rationale to go against coercion in these sort of things. There's another reason why autonomy is compatible with coercion. There's a long history that autonomy is compatible with self-coercion. Here we have Odysseus trying to avoid the sirens and he's tying himself to the mast, to self-coercion. So autonomy is not the shield, not the card which the human rights doctrine plays. And that's surprising. So what's the card? What's the rationale behind this idea that the things you do in psychiatry in this country under the MHA are in violation of human rights? What's the answer? I think the answer is to do with liberty as distinguished from autonomy. And in particular, a very particular conception of liberty, namely liberty as republican freedoms. Now, what's that? Republican freedom can be perhaps briefly defined as security from arbitrary interference. Security from arbitrary interference. Okay. Now, the key thing here is what matters is not just that I'm not actually interfered with. In fact, Republican freedom is compatible with a state interfering with me in non-arbitrary ways. What Republican freedom is against is not necessarily interference, but arbitrary interference. And particularly what Republican freedom is about is the liability to be arbitrarily interfered. Now, what's that idea? It comes sort of from Roman law and from the Roman Republican. And the idea was that the contrast to being a Republican free member of the Republic, is to be a slave. A slave under Roman law was a non-person. They didn't have any rights. Their owner could do anything they liked with them, legally speaking. Now, you might think that's a bad thing, clearly, but why is it? Why is the contrast to being a slave security from arbitrary interference? What is this idea of being not liable to be interfered? Now, imagine now I'm a Roman slave, and Martin here is my benign slave owner. And Martin thinks, this Reinhagen chap, he quite likes to do philosophy. Let him do philosophy. I'm a happy slave, you think. Why is there any problem? The problem is that Martin could change his mind any second and just whip me to death, or take away my philosophy books, which would be almost as bad. So I'm liable to his whims. And that's what Republican freedom is trying to avoid. Avoiding being a slave means having security against being subject to the whims of others, whether it's the whims of a slaveholder, however benign they might be, or the whims of a state. Particularly, it's about security against arbitrary interference of the state. Not any interference. If the state issues a just law which taxes me and then takes away some of my salary, that's not arbitrary interference. That's not a violation of my Republican freedom. But if they just arrest me in the middle of the night without a warrant, that's a violation of my Republican freedom. Okay, I think this idea of Republican freedom is why the human rights community now thinks that coercion in psychiatry is a violation of human rights. They think coercion in psychiatry is a violation basically of Republican freedom. It deprives them, these people who are subject to it, of security from arbitrary interference. Now, that might surprise you, and you might think that's wrong because it's not arbitrary interference, and we're getting to that. So let's try to understand a bit more, what would it mean to be non-arbitrarily interfered with? That's obviously the crux. Now, one idea here is just this Roman idea that you have, in order to be non-arbitrarily interfered with, requires that the interference happens according to a just law, and where that just law involves mechanism of reviewing what is happening to you, and if something wrong happened to you, of redressing it. Okay, also part of that sort of idea is that if I'm deprived of liberty, that's always a wrong. It might be a wrong which can be outweighed by other things, but it's always, first of all, a wrong. It's an interesting idea because here, liberty is not like autonomy, a threshold concept. It's not the case that if I haven't got certain inner capacities, I don't have autonomy, people can do with me whatever I like. Liberty, in particular Republican freedom, is not a threshold concept. You can be deprived, you can be arbitrarily interfered with, even if you don't have mental capacity, even if you're a baby, even if you're in a coma. It's not a threshold concept. It's a concept about in which social relations you stand to others. And the idea is you shouldn't stand in social relations to others where you're dependent on their whim, on their arbitrary interference with you. That's the key idea. And that's why liberty, deprivations for liberty, always raise an issue and always need a justification why it's not arbitrary. And you find echoes of that in history. If you think about the Mental Health Act and the procedural safeguards it includes, like mental health tribunals, that's meant to be a kind of echo of that we are not arbitrarily depriving people of their liberty, but they have review and redress mechanisms. And similarly, under the Mental Capacity Act, you find this idea, one of its principles is that you should use the least restrictive option. And if you do deprive people of liberty, extra safeguards have to kick in. That's, if you like, an echo of this idea of Republican freedom. But the question is whether the echoes in these sorts of legislations are enough of echoes or they are too faint. A more far-reaching answer, what is required for non-arbitrary interference, is that the laws have to be such that everybody is subject to them on an equal basis. It can't be that I'm subject to it because of a particular reason, I don't know, I have long hair or something, and you're not subject to it because you don't have long hair. That's arbitrary law. It has to be on equal basis. Now, if Republican freedom might be compatible with depriving people of their liberty to prevent danger to themselves or danger to others from materializing, to prevent harm. Republican freedom might be compatible to prevent harm by preventively detaining people. But the key thing is, whatever preventative detention we have has to be on an equal basis. And that suggests that it might rule out, at least these human rights communities would suggest, that rules out basing the risk of harm to others or harm to self on the nature and degree of mental disorder. So the key thought here is that it's arbitrary if we do not preventively detain people without a mental disorder diagnosis when they are a risk to self and others, but do detain those with a diagnosis. It's not necessarily arbitrary to preventively detain people, but it would be arbitrary, that's the thought, if we do it selectively, discriminatively in a certain sense. We might know that, for example, young men on Friday evening are going to be harm to themselves and others. We might have pretty good data that it's going to happen. But if we don't detain those on Friday evenings, but only criminally persecute them afterwards, but detain others on the basis of a mental health diagnosis, then arguably we are doing something which is arbitrary. We're doing it not on an equal basis. In particular, someone like George Smuggler, retired from the Maudsley, has argued that the objective risks involved to harm to self and others are not well tracked by whether the people have a mental health diagnosis. Often the risks to self and others will be bigger in cases where people don't have a diagnosis, and often when they do have a diagnosis, they are smaller. And this leads me now finally to human rights. Back to that. I've given you now, I think, a bit of a rationale for now being able to understand what I introduce to you next. So the human rights context I was referring to is a UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, the CRPD, as it's often known. It was adopted in 2006. It was negotiated at the UN. There was a major role played by activists from the disability community, including some people from the mental health disability community. It came into force in 2008. The UK has ratified it. Having ratified it doesn't mean that it's a law which is directly applicable in the UK courts, but it does mean that the UK has committed itself to changing its laws in such a way that they are in line with the human rights doctrine. And we will hear a bit later from Jill how that is going in Scotland. It operates with a social model of disability. Disability is not just something intrinsic to a person, but depends on the social context they're in. Mental disorder is one of the recognized disabilities under the convention. So the convention thinks that what you psychiatrists do with people who diagnosed with mental disorder falls under its remit. And this convention does mention autonomy, but I want to suggest the real driving force for the things which are relevant for you is Republican freedom. So how's that? One key article is Article 12. Article 12 says that people should get equal recognition before the law. The right to recognition, everybody has persons before the law, everybody has that, and persons with disabilities enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others in all aspects of life. That's really this idea of non-arbitrarily. People have rights and they have it on a non-arbitrary basis, on an equal basis. Now, one brief thing about legal capacity here, you might have jumped out on you. Legal capacity is different from mental capacity. It's not a threshold concept. Legal capacity is that you're a holder of rights, that you have rights, and that you can exercise these rights. That's what this convention means of legal capacity. And you can exercise these rights, this convention and its committee things, irrespective of whether you have a mental capacity to decide these things or other things like that. And then comes a really important article, which is relevant to all of you. That's Article 14, liberty and security of the person. Again, I think it's a clear echo here of Republican freedom. State parties shall ensure that persons with disabilities on an equal basis with others, again, the non-arbitrariness, enjoy the right to liberty and security of person, are not deprived of a liberty unlawfully or arbitrarily, and that any deprivation of liberty is in conformity with the law, so it has to be lawful, and that the existence of a disability shall in no case justify a deprivation of liberty. That last little phrase is why the human rights community thinks coercion in psychiatry, as it's currently constituted in this country under the MHA, is in violation of human rights law, because it makes reference with something which the Human Rights Committee thinks is arbitrary and not an equal basis, namely a mental health diagnosis, having a mental disorder of a nature and degree which warrants, etc., etc. That clause would be in violation of Article 14. Not having a preventative detention clause, that not, but a preventive detention on the basis of mental diagnosis. So the news is, this is a violation of human rights, at least as the UN is concerned. And I think the rationale for it is this idea of Republican freedom. And I think we can see that now. In a not 2027, but 2017 report, wasn't that recent or that much in the future, sorry. The then Special Rapporteur for Health, Daniel Puras, who is a child psychiatrist, envisaged a future of psychiatry without coercion. And I suspect, I didn't talk to Frank and Martin about it, I suspect that sort of report is partly the context for a meeting we're having today. Okay. Now, at the beginning, I said autonomy isn't the rationale. Then I said Republican freedom is the rationale for non-coercion and for coercion being in violation of human rights doctrine. Now I want to say the third thing. Why is, once you see that Republican freedom is driving this, why is it that more radical changes are probably afoot? And you should sit up for those too. One might think that you only really achieve non-arbitrariness in interference if we as a public, we collectively have democratic control and oversight about what we are subject to. Only if we are not slaves, but we collectively decide how much we interfere with each other in a just process of democratic decision-making, only then do we achieve Republican freedom. That might be the thought. And that has implications for psychiatry. You might think psychiatric diagnostic criteria are the kind of thing which are just objective science, and so no, the demos doesn't have a say on the matter or shouldn't have a say on the matter. But here, I think others, including myself, would want to push back. Psychiatric diagnostic criteria are shot through with value judgments that are not the purview of psychiatry. These value judgments are things which we as a demos, as a people, need to make up our minds about. That is obscured by thinking of diagnostic criteria as being just scientific results of a biomedical model of human beings. And once you realize that they are not just that, but their values shot through these diagnostic criteria, and we as a demos have to decide about it. That means we as a demos need to have some democratic oversight about what counts as a mental disorder or not. If you want a full book-length treatment on that, Derek Bolton is a good way to start. Secondly, one might argue, and Joanna Moncrief, professor of psychiatry at UCL, has argued that psychiatry, in effect, is a social practice that deals with those who experience unusual experiences and exhibit troubling or troubled behavior, but are then deemed by society that they shouldn't be criminalized for that troubling or troubling behavior, or for this sort of experience, but they require care, often against their will. And if that's what this practice of psychiatry in effect is, not necessarily a self-conception of it, but in effect as a social practice, then again you might think that is a practice which can only be non-arbitrary. It's a practice of some form of social control over those who we deem to have troubling experiences or behavior. We can only have that as a practice, as non-arbitrary, if there is much more democratic oversight and control of them. And you might think that for this control to be really democratic and non-arbitrary, experts by experience would have to be given much more of a privileged role, by which might be mainly an epistemic privilege role. They might have to be given a much bigger voice in what counts as troubling and troubled experiences and behavior. There's one more reason for democratic control, which I want to mention before I run out of time. And that's to do with the fact that there's a growing evidence base that mental distress is due to what we might call social illness. It's not a matter of brain chemistry, but a matter of being subject to adverse psychosocial circumstances. And if that is so, then preventative measures would have to be at the social level too. And indeed, they would be more effective at that level rather than trying to remedy these things at the end. For we all know, no mass disorder has ever been eliminated by treating one person at a time. Only prevention reduces incidence. And prevention might here mean changes at the social level, not at the medical. For example, Wilkinson and Pickett suggest that if we move from an extremely unequal society like the US, or to some extent the UK, to a more equal one like Germany or Spain to some extent, that would mean halving the rate of mental disorder. Now, this is controversial, but at least what I want to suggest here is if there's something in that, then this is much more a social matter, the preventative side. And then again, it's much more a matter for democratic control. Okay, here's my summary. That was a whistle-stop tour, and it's not in order. Here's the right one. Mental Health Act sectioning is not compliant with human rights, or at least not with contemporary understanding of human rights. That was the news I started. Autonomy is not the underlying rationale for that, because it's surprisingly compatible with coercion. Republican freedom is the underlying rationale. Once we understand what Republican freedom is about and what it requires to protect it, then we can see that there are much more radical changes in the offing. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be speaking here today. Can you hear me at the back? Because I'm quite softly spoken. But, I'm sorry, my slides are very boring after Fabian's wonderful slides. I apologize, that's sort of in keeping with the lawyer thing, we're very boring. Basically, what I'm going to be talking about is the fact that coercion is often justified on personal protection and public safety grounds, as we've heard. And in fact, in many cases, the use of laws that authorize psychiatric coercion is increasing. And we have that problem in Scotland. I mean, apart from a slight drop during the COVID years, despite our human rights-based mental health law, which is obviously different to the one in England and Wales, the use of coercion under mental health legislation and the use of Adults with Incapacity Act, or equivalent of the Mental Capacity Act in England and Wales, has been increasing. But it's also become increasingly clear that even so-called human rights-based mental health and capacity laws might not be effective. Might not be effective rights protectors, and in fact are discriminatory, as Fabian was saying before. The World Psychiatric Association has endorsed the reduction of coercion, and also endorsed the use of evidenced alternatives to coercion. This is obviously reflected by the WHO Quality Rights Initiative, which Martin could tell you much more about. But it does raise a thorny question what do we actually mean by human rights-based approach? It's a term that's bandied around all over the place. Oh, we adopt a human rights-based approach to our practice, to our laws, to whatever. But the fact is, it's not that clear. Do we mean the more restrictive traditional approach where it's okay to detain people because they have a mental disorder, a diagnosis of mental disorder and or related impairment, subject to safeguards, making sure that it's not too much and we use the least restrictive option? Or do we adopt the CRPD approach, which Fabian was talking about before, which is basically saying you can't do that if you're going to treat people on an equal basis with each other, if their human rights are going to be enjoyed on an equal basis with others, the comparator being everybody else, and not, oh, it's okay to do that, as has traditionally been the case, because we detain and we restrict the autonomy of people with a diagnosis of a mental disorder. So, and we do it with everybody subject to safeguards. So what are we talking about? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And it was something that the Scottish Mental Health Law Review, which ran between 2019 and 2022, and I was on the team for that, which is also referred to as the Scott Review, not because a short version of the Scottish Mental Health Law Review, it's because the chair was Lord John Scott, KC. And I'm not saying that we have all the answers to this, but I want to talk about some of the challenges and our suggested solutions, because we obviously thought about this when we were looking at the review and reform of our mental health and capacity law in Scotland. So going back to the issue of what is actually meant by human rights-based approach. Well, there are huge cultural and structural challenges, and these are the ones that we faced as well by the Scott in the Scott Review. We've heard about already Articles 12 and 14 of the CRPD, which basically, as interpreted by the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as disallowing psychiatric coercion, because that, if you single out certain groups of people for detention and compulsory treatment, that's treated on the basis of a diagnosis or related impairment. That's not allowing somebody to enjoy their rights on an equal basis with others. It's discrimination. So it's considering what's been going on in previous years. That's a pretty difficult thing to consider, as you will be well aware from your practice. So that challenge to existing human rights norms that exist, well, those that existed before the CRPD was adopted, has also led to what has been coined by Wayne Martin and Sandor Gabay as the Geneva impasse. In other words, there are different committees with human rights committees and bodies within the UN who feel differently. There are some, for example, the Human Rights Committee that oversees the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that believes it's okay to detain and treat people against their will, provided there are safeguards and it's the last resort. But then obviously you have the more radical CRPD position. So even the UN bodies are not agreeing on this. So how do you reconcile those different views? And that's something we had to face in our review. And also for countries that are state parties to the European Convention on Human Rights, Articles 5 and 8 of the Convention are being increasingly interpreted by the European Court of Human Rights as requiring respect for autonomy, respect for liberty, but they still allow ultimately detention and treatment against someone's will if they have a diagnosis or related impairment. However, I actually feel that a view that we took on the review, that you can still read the CRPD into that. You can still, you take the notion of liberty, autonomy an awful long way looking at that, even if you're having to consider compliance with the European Convention. Obviously in the UK, right across the UK, and Scotland's no different, we have to comply with the European Convention on Human Rights. It's incorporated, and it's also incorporated into our legal systems, so the rights are legally enforceable, unlike at the moment the CRPD rights, which are not legally enforceable nationally. There's also concerns about risk, and we face that in Scotland. Obviously, and very, very genuine concerns from clinicians and social workers about too much autonomy or completely eliminating psychiatric coercion. And interestingly, when we took evidence we engaged widely across the whole, all stakeholder groups, and particularly with people with lived experience and their families, there was real concern that if psychiatric coercion was completely eliminated in Scotland, people would be put at risk of harm to themselves and to others, and there was a real concern about that. And that's really interesting, and it's something I want to look into a bit more. Obviously, there is a genuine concern of the risk, but how much of that is self-stigmatization? People believe that they're risky because they're told that they're risky. So that's something we need to look at. The other thing that we came across was the fact that coercion is sometimes used to access support where there are resourcing challenges. We all know that mental health systems are woefully underfunded in comparison with physical health systems in many countries, and Scotland is the same. And time again, we were hearing from clinicians, we really don't want to section people, but it's the only way that we can ensure that they will receive the support and the treatment that they otherwise may not be able to get, because the law provides that they must receive it, the notion of reciprocity, and that's certainly a principle that underpins our law in Scotland. So what were we looking at in Scotland? Well, our mental health and capacity legislation, when it was enacted in the early part of the 21st century, was internationally heralded as being amazing human rights-based mental health and capacity law, because the principles that underpinned it were human rights informed. I have to say, at that stage, they weren't. It was just the European Convention. But over time, it became increasingly clear that the legislation was not meeting the needs of people that were supposed to be benefited by it, and was falling out of step very quickly with developing human rights standards, notably those promoted by the CRPD. And my colleague Colin Mackay and I undertook a law reform scoping exercise in 2016, 2017, and that sort of reinforced the fact that our laws and our sort of prominence in terms of our laws across the world had slipped back quite considerably. And the fact was that although we did have at the time when it was enacted ECHR, civil rights safeguards, and that underpinned the principles that governed whether somebody would be subjected to non-consensual interventions, that was all that it focused on. They were there to protect autonomy, protect liberty, and instill the notion of least restrictive options and keep people's voices alive throughout the whole process. But it was only related to basically crisis situations, and not dealing with someone's wider needs, their needs in terms of living in the community, living independently, employment, education, social welfare, etc. It really didn't cover that. So as a result of this, an independent review of our mental health and capacity law was announced by the Scottish Government in May 2019. And the remit was to look at how we could improve the rights and protections of people who may be subject to the existing provisions of mental health incapacity and adult support protection legislation as a consequence of having a mental disorder. And I can tell you right away that we recommended that the term mental disorder, because of its stigmatizing connotations and discriminatory connotations, should be wiped from the statute books. We're still working on an alternative.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, do you want me to put this up?
Yes,
Yeah. Right there.
yes.
Okay. Okay. I hope you can hear me better now. Good. And it was also made very clear that the lived experience had to be at the centre of the review, and we also had to seriously consider CRPD compliance and economic, social and cultural rights. In other words, the rights that really underpin someone's wider needs beyond just protecting someone from arbitrary and unwarranted interferences and intrusions on their autonomy, their liberty. So after 3 years of obviously battling also with lockdown, etc., and COVID restrictions, we took a lot of evidence right across the stakeholder groups. And we reported last September, a year ago, in September, nearly a year ago. And there were sort of 3 broad themes to our final report. One was that it was absolutely necessary to change our laws so that the voice of the individual was strengthened. At the moment, we have a principle that says that you have to have regard for the present and past ascertainable wishes and feelings of the person, but it's only one of a number of different principles that have to be taken into account. So it's not there, it doesn't have primacy, it's just one, and it can easily be the person's voice can easily be silenced if people feel that it's in their benefit, which we introduced in our laws, in our legislation, to try and overcome the paternalistic or the arguably paternalistic connotations attached to best interests decisions. But in fact, it worked out that we hear the use of best interests all the time. The other theme was reducing coercion, and obviously I'm going to concentrate on that, and also strengthening rights, but strengthening rights more generally, so not just civil rights related to non-consensual interventions, but actually those rights that are needed to meet people's needs at the right time, so economic, social and cultural rights in particularly. We really thought about the CRPD committee's requirement to completely eliminate psychiatric coercion. And we realized that at the moment in Scotland, we couldn't do that immediately, but that should be our ultimate aim, the ultimate elimination of psychiatric coercion. But we definitely had to be sort of moving towards that, and we shouldn't be any slippage. And I'll talk a bit more about our reasoning behind that. And we thought there were 2 main issues related to reducing coercion, the problems with coercion in Scotland. First was that we have capacity or a form of capacity under the Mental Health Act, significantly impaired decision-making ability thresholds. If you have significantly impaired decision-making ability, or you under the Mental Health Act, or you are deemed to be an incapable adult under the Adults with Incapacity Act, then you are liable to be considered for non-consensual interventions under either or both of the acts. But the problem was that they're very blunt instruments for determining whether or not somebody should be given support or not. And we were finding that they weren't uniformly, the tests for capacity were not uniformly being used. They were very much informed by risk, and in some cases, people who just needed support were being found to lack capacity because of the risk element, and therefore they're being restricted where they didn't need to, in areas of their lives that they didn't need to be restricted. On the other hand, there were people who were being found not to lack capacity, but who were clearly in a lot of distress and needed support, but were being told, don't go away, you've got capacity, we're going to respect your decisions there. And there'll be families and friends and even the person themselves, but I'm in distress, I need support. So it wasn't helping. And there was also, as you probably are very well aware here as well, a real lack of alternatives support that are supported by economic, social and cultural rights to ensure that they were provided alternatives to coercion. So apart from taking evidence from a number of different areas, we obviously heard what was going on in Heidenheim, in Trieste as well. We were very much influenced by Professor Denis Puas when he was in his report that Fabian's already mentioned in 2017, when he was the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. And he made it very clear that coercion perpetuates stigma and discrimination, but also acknowledged that radical reduction and eventual elimination is challenging. It is really challenging. You need a whole culture change, you need a whole sort of institutional change, reallocation of resourcing, probably definitely more resourcing to the mental health system. And it will take time, but it has to take place. There's no room for slippage, particularly the way things are moving in the international human rights field. And he proposed a plan of action which was basically there should be mainstream alternatives, not just soft alternatives, but mainstream recognized alternatives. He refers to a well-stocked basket of alternatives, a roadmap to radically reduce psychiatric coercion, exchange of good practice, and to scale up research and investment and data collection for monitoring, and also working out with the robust evidence-based alternatives to coercion. And basically to reiterate what I said before, Professor Puras said that focusing on authorising and regulating psychiatric coercion has promoted inequalities and discrimination, even perhaps where it's been inadvertently, well, that's inadvertently happened. And it has to be a refocusing of the wider rights situation and using the right to health as a vehicle to this. And actually, fortunately, we'd actually done that in our remit, in our terms of reference for our review. And we need more legally enforceable options and alternatives. So our roadmap to reducing coercion, we suggested in our final report. As I said, this isn't necessarily the answer, and it's an overview, and there's a lot of detail that I can fill in that was in the report, but also that's got to be worked on going forward, as these are recommendations, they're not law yet. We said that recommended there should be a clear policy to reduce coercion, but it should be on the road to eventual elimination of coercion. And that mental health law and mental capacity legislation in Scotland should be repurposed. And what we meant was we take the focus away from the law primarily regulating and authorising non-consensual legal capacity limiting measures to focusing on meeting individual needs appropriately and at the right time, so people's needs are met in the right way at the right time. And to support this, and I could go on all day about this particular framework. I don't have time. I'm happy to talk about it later. We propose that there be a human rights enablement, a supported decision making, and an autonomous decision making framework. Each element of that being a different approach. The human rights enablement would be to work out in each case what was actually required to respect somebody's rights overall on an equal basis with others. And it would look at the whole range of rights, not just civil and political rights. Obviously supported decision-making to make sure that the exercise of someone's legal capacity is respected on an equal basis. And rather than autonomous decision-making, rather than capacity test, an autonomous decision-making test, which goes beyond mental capacity tests. It recognises that sometimes someone's condition may impair their decision making, but obviously there are lots of cases. Well, in fact, in many cases where people have challenges to decision making, supported decision making can help to overcome those. But there are also we've also recognized there are other things that make it difficult for all of us to make decisions at given times. You know, we could be subject to a coercive environment, a coercive relationship. We might have a physical illness. So we recognize that it went beyond that, and the idea was to look at that in conjunction with the human rights enablement. What's needed for this person this time? Not necessarily okay, the person has failed the autonomous decision-making test, therefore coercion is the answer. What actually is on offer to help this person and meet their needs? And ultimately, it might mean that there is coercion, but on an equal basis with others. Just I think I won't sort of go on much. I can talk about that later if you have any questions. What was the response to our report? Well, after nearly a year, well, about 10 months of silence, apart from the fact that the then Scottish minister who had the portfolio for mental health, the capacity law, did comment that the report was very long. It was 1,000 pages and over 200 recommendations. But I mean, we wanted to do the job properly, and we had spent 3 years gathering an awful lot of evidence. the Scottish Government did respond in June to that reply at high level. We had fortunately broad stakeholder support because we took stakeholders with us and we involved them very much in the review. 50% of all our advisory groups and our review team had lived experience, we consulted widely. The Scottish Government, in their high-level response in June, broadly supported our recommendations and said that they were setting in place a programme of reform with various priorities, and reducing coercion, fortunately, is one of them. However, the devil is in the detail, and the detail so far is lacking. They've promised us this autumn a delivery plan, so we're obviously waiting on that, and some of us are lobbying the government regularly to make sure that they don't forget the overall ethos and that we don't go down different rabbit holes and forget what we were supposed to do in the first place. But we'll have to wait and see what happens going forward. That's all I want to say.
Very much.
With a load of references because it's an academic afternoon.
So we're going to continue with our second half of the academic afternoon. I heard lots of people raising the kind of duty of care question. What are we going to do if we actually end up in a situation where the law is actually depriving us of some of those tools, so to speak? And I guess, importantly, we've already heard there's a plea really for an enhanced provision of care in the community. And I guess the next couple of talks will hopefully give us a few ideas and examples as to how that might look like. And the first speaker I would like to introduce is my colleague, Martin Zinkler, who, as you heard, was a colleague working in Newham as a consultant for many years. He's now the head of the department in the mental health service in Bremen, a large institution where he is responsible for community outpatient hospital as well as home treatment. Martin is also the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Psychiatry for the German-speaking countries, and he publishes mainly on human rights and mental health care. And this is his talk, Experience in Managing Mental Health Crisis Without Coercion. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you very much, Frank. And so I hope I have to unmute myself. So there you are. So now we're online and we can hear each other. Thank you very much. This is lovely. And I start with a few references. Obviously, there are these photographs. The left one is the blue horse, which stands for the Trieste experience, on which we will hear much more later. Then there's the blue camel. That's kind of an imitation of the Trieste experience, deinstitutionalization in Bremen, actually. So a bit of local history. There's a typical Bremen building in the background. And on the right-hand side, this is where I work at the moment. This is part of the institution, part of the old asylum, which still functions in the parts as an asylum in Bremen. And hear about that more, and maybe we all have our references for what we do, and the Trieste experience is one for me. But before Trieste, there was Gorizia, and the person left to the microphone there on this photograph, which is from the early 80s, is Giovanni Jervis. He actually wrote a critical textbook of psychiatry. And this is a quote: "Everything seems new, but nothing has changed. If the inmate does not become a subject again, if he's not given back his human dignity, if he does not gradually regain the right to speak and also the right to protest, if he does not have the possibility in real terms to make a series of decisions, then there is a danger that the restructuring of the insane asylum will continue to be a fiction, an empty shell." And I just happen to think that Jervis at the time had an idea of what service would be developing or shaping themselves. So that's the plan for the next 27 minutes. Human rights and mental health care. What do UN bodies and the WHO have to say about it? Then a bit more about WHO program Then where are we now? What could be indicators of progress towards human rights, toward coercion-free mental health care? And then in the last part, how it actually would look like if we would make the radical shift to coercion-free mental health care. What would it mean in dealing with risk in hospital work, in police custody, and indeed in prison? And so that's been written up by Sebastian and me a few years back in 2019. It's an open access paper if you're interested. It started with the UN Convention on the Rights of, well, it didn't start, it started long ago, as we heard from Fabian, but the cornerstone, of course, is the convention, which I won't go into detail. Of course, Germany ratified it. And then it was a little quiet, but the bombshell was Juan Mendes, at the time Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment for the United Nations. It is essential. Mendes said that an absolute ban on all coercive and non-consensual measures, including restraint and solitary confinement of people with psychological or intellectual disabilities. So here's the definition of coercion. Should apply in all places of deprivation of liberty, including in psychiatric and social care institutions. And then the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was set up to interpret the convention, has been stated by the committee in several concluding observations: forced treatment by psychiatry and other health and medical professionals is a violation of the right to equal recognition before the law, as Fabian outlined to us earlier, and an infringement of the rights to personal integrity and other articles of the convention. All forms of support in the exercise of legal capacity, including more intensive forms of support, must be based on the will and preferences of the person, not on what is perceived as being in his or her objective best interest. And then it's also been mentioned twice today, Danius Puras, that's how he looks like, a child and adolescent psychiatrist who had worked during Soviet times and still works in his profession. Coercion in psychiatry perpetuates power imbalances in care relationships, causes mistrust, exacerbates stigma and discrimination. It has made many turn away, fearful of seeking help within mainstream mental health services. Immediate action is required to radically reduce coercion and facilitate the move towards an end to all forced psychiatric treatment. And so I was delighted to hear from Jill that that recommendation has been taken up by the Scott Review. And then a Jordanian prince, Said al-Hussein, at the time UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, so quite high up in the UN hierarchy, I was explained. So one thing is one of those special rapporteurs says something, but it's a different thing if the High Commissioner actually repeats it. And he asked for the elimination of practices such as forced treatment, including forced medication, forced ECT, forced institutionalization, and segregation. Instead, he called on states to ensure access to a range of support services within the community. And so essentially, the prince is saying the same. And then to complete the round, Catalina de Vandas Aguilar, at the time Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, states must abolish and prohibit all regimes of substituted decision-making, particularly relevant for countries who operate a guardianship system, as there are many, including Germany. And yeah, all forms of substitute decision-making are prohibited under the convention, including those based on the assessment of mental capacity skills, which is kind of contradicting what George Smuckler and the people who sort of advocate for capacity-based interventions or incapacity-based interventions, for that matter, argue for. So, and then something interesting happened, because the WHO, who had been up until that point fairly sort of mainstream, they just repeated what the World Psychiatric Association had to say. they changed gear, they changed direction and just took on and fully and wholeheartedly WHO took on the UN positions and with a whole program consisting of the quality rights training, consisting on the 21 guidance, then new guidance on mental health, human rights and legislation that come out this year, and the further guidance on national mental health policies in the making. The first was the quality rights training, comprehensive training materials, traditional training, but also e-training, and for everyone, for users, for family, staff, policymakers, lawyers, police officers, us, psychiatrists. So for everyone, you can just register there in your preferred language and do it online and you get a certificate. So then the 2021 WHO guidelines came out, guidance on community mental health services, promoting person-centered and rights-based approaches. And if you want to, you could summarize the whole 600 pages into one sentence. And you may actually remember WHO saying there is no health without mental health. And now the ultra brief summary would be there is no mental health without human rights. But that's the quote from it: substituted decision-making, coercion and institutionalization must be replaced with support for the exercise of legal capacity, for independent living in the community and for other human rights. And in the guidance, they present so 23 services from all around the world. And I was a little shocked at the time when they contacted me when I was working in Heidenheim and saying, yeah, we are interested, and do you have information about our service, about your service? So that's how Klinik in Landkreis Heidenheim got on this WHO guidance. And but it so happened, and the left upper corner, so the dog is actually, he also works in Heidenheim Mental Health Services as a therapy dog. So it's nice to see that photo on the, but obviously there are many other services presented, of course, the Trieste or Lille as shining examples of functioning mental health networks. And but also from other parts of the world, Brazil, Asia as well, Africa, basically just around the planet. And promoting the principles of the CRPT requires a major overhaul of laws related to mental health and other laws directly impacting on the lives of people with mental health conditions and psychosocial disabilities, for example, those governing voting, marriage, employment, education, amongst others. So vast approach, legislation concerning medical liability or medical malpractice should be further reformed in order to avoid practitioners resorting to the use of seclusion and restraints as a means to avoid risk of harm, and instead to promote the respect of people's rights. And so even that aspect is being touched on. And the next step now, which is developed while we wait for it, is guidance on legislation jointly with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, so WHO, UN, co-production, and so that's supposed to be published this year. So how should mental health legislation look like if you take all that on board? And the fourth part, which is currently being drafted, human rights aligned guidance on national mental health policies and action plans. And yeah, so far for the first part. And where are we now? The reality looks very different from what it should do. We have detention in hospital, coercion, restraints in Germany, mechanical restraint, here physical restraint, seclusion. We have involuntary medication in many countries now. We have community treatment orders. We have indefinite detention. We have substitute decision making, but also the field of informal coercion. And so we need to, if you want to think about progress, we need to look at possible indicators of progress towards human rights-based mental health care. So this is a slide with a few numbers. You see it's about detention in hospital, but in percent of inpatient cases, and in brackets, in population, for example, in Germany, per population, per 100,000 population, you get 49, 50 people coerced in a given year. That was from 29, the figure. So sorry, you get them detained in hospital, which is one form of coercion. So involuntary hospital admission. And in Heidenheim, that figure was 8.5, which incidentally is just about what it was in Trieste at the time, 8.11. And just to say how it is in Bremen, the service I'm working now, it's at 80, so it's 10 times higher. And that's the situation that you find in many countries. Certainly you find it in Germany, that the extent to which coercion is used varies so widely that something, I mean, it calls for attention. So why is it? And similar differences in other forms of coercion. For example, on the bottom line, it's about how often involuntary medication happens. And so in Heidenheim, there were in 2019, there were just 2 cases in that year. So it's almost stopped. And so how could a transformed system look like? So this is the vision. The question was, is it a myth or a vision, what we want to do? Or a nightmare, some might say. So non-discriminatory care succeeds when admission to a psychiatric care is only possible on a voluntary basis, even in a situation of risk to self or others. Otherwise, a type of detention may be undertaken that is not based on the presumption or detection of a mental disorder, but on the extent of the dangerousness. So society may decide, the demos may decide, yeah, some people we want to detain, but not on the presumption or assessment of a mental psychiatric diagnosis. The police would then ask about will and preferences of the person concerned and organize appropriate help, e.g. with consultations from mental health services in the police station by organizing a crisis accommodation, ideally user run. So that would be the alternative that Jill and the Scott Review asked for. Outpatient home treatment, inpatient treatment on a voluntary basis. That would be the alternatives to coercion. In hospital, traditionally, if one of our patients wants to be discharged, then a review takes place about so-called reasons for involuntary treatment, risk to self or others, and accordingly discharge or placement proceedings take place. And some patients just say, I stay voluntarily to avoid being sectioned. So the result, many of patients say what the clinicians want to hear, or they resist the deprivation of liberty, which is experienced as discriminatory. A new system would open the dialogue about the reasons for discharge and information about support options, but it would not be the patient's so-called well-being what counts, but the will and preferences. This fosters mutual trust, and then supportive decision-making needs to be put in place with information, counseling, involving families, friends, social network. This needs time. You need to find out about will and preferences, and then there may be a situation when will and preferences point in different directions. My suggestion here, my humble suggestion would be, I'm not a lawyer, is that if will and preferences point in different directions, then a short court-ordered stay in hospital could be brought about in order to align will and preferences. So far, we always use will and preferences But George Schmuckel has come up with an idea what the difference between the two may be. You may also have your own ideas about, but if there are two terms being used, then there must be something different. Otherwise, you could just use the one or the other. I also had my go on what that might be, so that's also free access. It's only when will and preferences cannot be determined that the best possible interpretation of will and preference will be established. And to guide treatment and care, the determination of the capacity to consent no longer plays a role. The hospital no longer performs the function of social control. So that's going to be history in a visionary new system. In police custody, traditional, different, and thus discriminatory rules apply to people with psychiatric diagnosis than to people without. Such an attribution. Discrimination, however, is eliminated in the new system, so intervention from mental health services will only take place with informed consent. Whether police custody is carried out or continued is no longer based on the assumption of a mental disorder, but on the general provisions for deprivation of liberty, e.g. the intention to bring the person before a magistrate. Extremely dangerous people, that's at least the situation in Germany, can go into preventive detention, but it's mainly used for terrorists. And it's very few. And every day, hundreds of persons across Germany go into preventive detention to psychiatric institutions. So even so, if you just look at the numbers of how many people got preventively detained without mental disorder, and how many got detained with an attributed, diagnosed, proven, can be organic disorders, well discerned. But if you just look at the numbers, you see how discriminatory the system works. The role of mental health services in the new system would be to provide information, counseling, assistance, especially social assistance and treatment. This strengthens legal protection when accepting an offer of assistance, gives the person the confidence that they can always reject the assistance offered at a later stage. So you could say in the new system, you could say, yes, I'm going voluntary in hospital, but you would know exactly the moment you decide to leave, at that moment, the door opens. Just imagine for a moment how much trust that would generate between us and the people we are entrusted with. And yesterday we had the testimony of a user who unfortunately is not here, but she said that I have no problem in saying things that I don't, that are not true to a person who just checks on me every 15 minutes. But if that person had been the person who asked me to tell the story that it is, and who offered me a cup of tea, and who actively engaged with me to get me out of seclusion, then I would find it much more difficult to actually tell that person I'm fine when I'm not. So psychosocial services does gain the trust of service user, which arguably is the most active ingredient in any form of treatment and support that we provide. Favorable conditions are created for coping with crisis. In the spirit of solidarity, psychiatry is no longer on the side of the regulatory power, but on the side of those affected by mental health problems and likely in prison. All psychosocial support and treatment is subject to the will and preferences of the person concerned, and thereby builds resilience in the person concerned, but also resilience in the system. What we learn how to do without coercion, if we don't use coercion anymore, however, as long as the coercive option exists, that's another one of my suggestions. As long as the coercive option exists, we will just use it. The principle of non-discrimination applies when deciding on pretrial detention or criminal detention. In case of mental illness, criminal detention or deprivation of liberty may not last longer than without such an illness, which is an interesting part. I'm not sure if Roberto has that on his slides, but in Germany, if you end up in forensic psychiatry, that's open-end. Because at the point you are in forensic services, you have to prove that you are not dangerous anymore. While if you go to prison, you have a maximum term. that maybe a few years, a few more years, but you know, after 5 years, the 10 years, you're out. Not so in forensic psychiatry. And Italy changed that actually. So with the reform of forensic services, so there's a maximum duration for forensic psychiatric detention, just as there is for prison. And the two must be the same. But, and I think it's an excellent example how you can move from discriminatory to non-discriminatory. And which, by the way, provides forensic services with a huge incentive to start rehabilitation from the first day in detention, which I can certainly say for German forensic psychiatry is not the case. So you're admitted that you are there. The first thing is to make you kind of use that you are there and for the foreseeable future. Of course, with the rates of forensic psychiatric inpatients raising, new forensic units being built right across the German Länder, and so it's not a good way that services are developing. It's at least my point of view. Referral to a forensic psychiatry system in the new vision would only be possible with informed consent. So I'm not asking to remove forensic services. I think they play an excellent role. I think they actually do excellent work. And that's well evidenced, but with informed consent. Service user decides whether she remains in prison or whether she goes into forensic services. So a support-only system, that's moving to the summary, follows the interpretation of Article 12 of the Convention by the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, no longer exercises a regulatory function of social control, does not discriminate against people with psychiatric diagnosis, but offers support in all places where it is needed, at home, in police custody, in prison, in hospital, but also would provide support only in those areas where support is requested. I mean, how many of our service users actually say, at least in Bremen, they say, really, doctor, the only thing I need is housing. When we say, well, that's difficult, there's supported housing, 3 months, 6 months waiting list, better you first come to hospital. So you're trapped in the system. And then the housing association say, yeah, oh, there's a mental diagnosis, so he should be in a special place for people with mental health problems. We can't just take him on for housing. So that's where discrimination kicks in. So the whole system is, well, I leave it up to you to decide what it is. So provide support only in those areas where support is requested. Example, given housing, access to financial resources, even if other issues seem more urgent to the clinical team, such as abstinence from drugs or adherence to medication. And well, thank you very much.
Yes, it's a great pleasure to be here. And of course, I will try to summarize some of the point of the experience in Italy and in Trieste, particularly regarding the issue of today, so the psychiatry in its relationship with coercive practices, which is one of the most difficult and terrible legacy we have, and we have to try to sort out from. Yeah, and of course, well, you mentioned the World Federation for Mental Health. This year is the title of the Mental Health Day. The dedication is to mental health as a universal human right. So that's very important. I think the great work done by the World Federation should be mentioned to identify key issues and topics in today's debate. And I think this is particularly timely because it's usually sometimes, we are forced as psychiatrists, the professionals in mental health, to put the health protection instead of the protection of the other rights, so the realization of the other human rights, like an opposition sometimes. So, but we think that it's possible to demonstrate that the protection of mental health the realization of mental health must be done and is reinforced by the implementation of all the other human rights, not instead of. So you know that this is a bit of history, as you mentioned. So, Italy enforced after a movement that is not anymore anyway existing, which was called Psychiatry Democratica, particularly, which started in the 60s in Gorizia and in other places in southern Italy too. It was not just Basaglia, but it was a group of advanced psychiatrists, like open-minded people who were director of mental hospitals in Italy, very badly regarded, socially regarded, because they were places of complete exclusion with a terrible law at the time. So, and Law 180 was the product of this movement somehow. And, you know, the most shocking data is that the reduction, half of patients were in the mental hospital at the time when the law was enforced. So the work done in the practice was able to diminish by half the number of inpatients in 1978 as referred to 1970. Well, that's the real number. 48,000 were in Italy. And when the law started, it took 20 years and more, 21 years to be overcome the situation of mental hospitals. They were all closed in 1999, apart from some private institutions that were all afterwards, they were also closed. And then we had the final digitalization with the closure of forensic hospitals, a very backward organization with 6 hospitals of medium to big size in some parts of Italy, where people were completely deported and stay for sometimes for life, because under the umbrella, under the definition of dangerousness. So very similar to what Martin mentioned about Germany. So we are now in a situation where it's navigating in not without any form of coercion, but despite the persisting forms of coercion in some aspects. But the law was very important, because the law was clearly defined the dangerousness that was mentioned in the previous law as the main reason for internment, is not anymore mentioned as the reason for involuntary treatment. There is no power assigned to the judiciary system. That's another peculiarity of the Italian law, but checking the rights of the person during the voluntary treatment, and also the reason why this has been applied, the consistency of the treatment, while the other rights of the person are ensured anyway. So it doesn't mean to have a detention in a place, it means to have the obligation to a treatment, which is for me important to mention, because it opens to a more flexibility and more negotiation about the kind of care you can offer. Doesn't mean you have to detain a person. And this is considered today a very backward vision of psychiatry. Psychiatric professionals don't have any right and any duty to detain any people anywhere in this country. And I think this is probably the most important legacy of this movement. The law was clearly the break of the complicity between traditional psychiatry, historical psychiatry based in institution, and law and order aspects. So this is about care, is about the care within the rights. It doesn't have nothing to do with the social control or custody, which is completely split from this law. So searching for voluntary care is still mandatory rule, even when you apply a compulsory treatment. So during the compulsory treatment, a clinician is obliged to try to get a consent to the person to care, and that the voluntary treatment must be stopped. Is this time limited? Usually a week, and then can be also repeated for another week, but you have to justify why. So it's not time unlimited. So it's very limited to a moment when the person seems to be not capable to manage his life. And so this means another important aspect. So involuntary placement, so-called now internationally, is not anymore possible for a long period of time. So people must be released, and at any time, they can be also, again, submitted to a voluntary treatment, but this doesn't mean you can have a career or of long-term inpatient anywhere, based on the disability. So there are some aspects which are still valid, also reviewing what happened with the CRPD that was mentioned by the first speaker. Of course, we can discuss about the difference between coercive care, coercion, and compulsion in care. So these are not the same thing. They are not the same thing. So we can discuss what does imply, because coercion can happen, for instance, also to people in voluntary care. People can be restrained, physically restrained. Sometimes this happened in Italy many times when for instance, acute inpatient wards in general hospitals. There was a scandal years ago to discover that 80% of these wards used coercion, physical restraint. And of course, there are many other aspects that we can mention, but I don't want to go on. But we can discuss maybe what does it mean, this difference between coercion and compulsion. Of course, the issue of open door come immediately. So it's not the Trieste aspect. Probably Trieste took it seriously and applied in the reality, having any place in the system with open doors, including the acute ward in general hospital. But this is embedded in the law. So every service can apply this concept of having an open door in and out. That means it's a walk-in place, and this place where you can go out when you decide not to accept care. Then there is the obligation and responsibility of the services to search for, to outreach the person, to try to convince and persuade the person to reaccept. And that this endless negotiation is the principle of it. So that's the experience that started, you know, probably very well, the story Basaglia, first closure of psychiatric hospital in Europe in 1980, with a total substitution with a network of community services, completely alternative. This implies also a shift from the typical psychiatric at that time model of treating a person, treating the illness, toward the focus on the person. So the famous quote, Basaglia, putting the illness in two parentheses. That means that you have to take care of the social implication, the personal experience, the social role, etc., and the social inclusion of the person, not just focusing on the treatment. Treatment is an aspect, but not everything. So that's why Trieste was confirmed as WHO collaborating center, as places of demonstration that cost effectiveness and respect of care. Yeah, we can describe the model, we can summarize in this way. Probably there are 4 keywords here: community, the person, illness, institution, the services at the middle. The community service role is to intermediate this very powerful, let's say, factors which are in play. So, of course, the push from the law, the institution that has to apply the laws in a restrictive way, the concept of illness that is related to the idea that illness contains risk and danger to social life, to the community, and of course the involvement of that community. The service must be accountable to that community, realize a community engagement, and provide care of the person not just into the community, but with the community. That's a key. So the community must become an asset with the person by dialogue and negotiation. Help the person in the recovery pathway and recovering the meaning of suffering, not just referring to the significant, to the insignificante, I don't know what is the English, the linguistic term, but of the illness, you know, as dominating the interpretation of what happens to the person in psychiatry. So it's clearly, we can describe three levels. One is the value level. These are simple quotes that can be understood by anyone. So treating the person, not treating the illness, as I said, respecting the user as a citizen with rights. So that means also maintaining social roles, be embedded in a social network, fostering recovery, change the attitude in the community, etc. And this can be translated into principles of care that must be enforced in the practice. It means focus on responsibility of the service for a given community. That means a catchment area in the terrible term, sorry. But anyway, that means you must be work with that community. You must be identified as the main service to that community, must be actively present in that community. That means not just mobility, but low threshold accessibility. People can just walk in the service, etc. And this means being proactive and prevent deterioration, prevent social drift and all the social consequences of mental illness, because it's your task to do it. If you are responsible of a community, not just of a phase of care or to a target aspect of illness, that's typical aspect of the functional models. And we argued a lot about that. But comprehensive view means the person is your problem, and you have to help this person clinically, but also socially, and involving all the social factors and determinants to achieve a result. This means you must maintain the continuity of care. So ideally not providing transitioning care from acute care to ongoing care to rehabilitation, blah, blah, blah. But the service must be like the guide, the tour operator, someone says, to accompany the person also through other resources, but doesn't mean that you pass the responsibility to another service. And this is the result of a fragmented system of care that can be ineffective at the end. And of course, this means also responding to crisis in the community, reduce the use of acute inpatient beds, for instance, even in general hospital is in our case, being comprehensive, so integrating social aspects of care. That means also referring and involving other services, so like the social services or the NGOs working in the community, and the teamwork that includes also the peers, but also the patients and the family. They are on board in a process of decision-making about care. So teamwork is not just the team setting up the community mental health team, but also working with all the actors which are in play. And this can issue at the end what we call a whole life approach with the person at the center. So the three levels, so principles and values, then procedures, but procedures are not leading and driving the service, in our opinion, because you can find different procedures or different practices to achieve the overarching aims, which are more important than procedures. So we don't need too many bullet points and procedures in services, because we must look at the aims that we are looking to. And of course, interactions between real people. At the end, this is the product. What happens to people in people-to-people relationship? And that means, of course, including the patient, but also the family, etc. This must be also rights-based and promoting empowerment, being multi-sectorial, as I said, and responding to the very nice 3E principle that you know, because it was declared some years ago by Graham Thornycroft and Michele Pancella in a famous book, Better Mental Health Care. Ethics and evidence and experiences of care, they come together. And evidence is not up and the other are not down. So the ethical aspects are very important, in particular the experiences of care of the patients and of the clinicians too. So this is very important. These are the features of service in Trieste. Quickly, there are 4 community mental health centers, plus 2 now because the territory of Gorizia that you mentioned before is now joined in the same wider organization. There is small unit in General Hospital with 6 emergency beds. Mental health center, they have beds, small number of community beds, which are very flexible to be used. So you can host people in crisis or to de-escalate a crisis, sometimes for social problems or sometimes to wait for a residential solution. If people are homeless for a while, they can stay in the center, they can receive support. And there is a service for rehabilitation, which for us is very important to manage the interface with the so-called non-clinical aspects of care, with the NGOs, with the associations, social cooperatives, etc., that contribute to a very important diffusion of practices in the city, so-called the diffuse daycare center. So the daycare is provided also by community association, community organization, but in agreement with the public service, not just loosely coupled, but strictly connected to a strategy that has agreed together with this organization. So this is a co-production, attempt to achieve co-production at any point of care. The Community Mental Health Center hosts a community team with about 30, 35 people of different, of course, professional roles. It's a multi-purpose and multifunctional, is a place that can be accessible for walking, request of care, and real-time response. But at the same time, is the basis for the team to go out, and there is a rotation of functions. So all the functions you can identify in a system like crisis care, ongoing care, assertive engagement, etc., are provided by the rotational function within the same team, which is because the focus is the person, regardless the phase of care or the quality of the relationship at that time. You have looked at the person in their story, and the story also includes the service. And sometimes there are ups and downs, and people can, can of course disconnect from the service, etc. And of course, the environment is very important. The mental health center must be not just a clinical feature, a clinical place. It's a place where people can just come and stay as a place for NGO, like a day center, like a community center, etc. Sorry, it stopped. Something happened with the slides. Can you help me? Okay. Yeah, so there is this one team that knows the person and can follow the person also during the crisis based on the previous knowledge and knowledge, particular relationship of trust that you can develop with the person. These are some of the, this is one of the center close to the 5-star hotel in Trieste. This is Barcola. In the background, you find Maria Teresa Greif. And there was some difficult cohabitation, and I don't say English good, but anyway, then but because of us, because some strange things happen in the hotel. This is the users told us from the window. Okay, and these are some of the living rooms of some of the centers. The addition was to develop healthcare budgets, personal budgets. Not just giving money to the hand of the person, but anyway, again, negotiating an additional care that regards the daily life of the person in the community, particularly housing, work placement, social relationship, and social inclusion activities. And the personal budget is a economic content, but this has been realized through the involvement of NGOs. So it's also a co-production at the level of the individual client that has, of course, as a say, as a voice in developing that program, and can choose which kind of program is adopted by the NGO to help his daily life. That's very important. It's about 20% of our, don't say our because I'm not anymore there. But anyway, of the budget, that is consistent number of, euros. This is one of the examples, cluster housing for those who don't want to stay in a group home because they prefer, of course, individual location. It's like a cluster, and with normal people also living in upper floor, etc. 9 people were living in this area, everyone with a small garden, and there is a support organized through personal budgets, 24 hours if possible, if needed, through the social cooperatives, which are in a very let's say discreta, what is English, way present, but not, not anyway oppressing people, but just staying there. These cooperatives provide work for about 300, training to work for about 350 people every year, using work grants to facilitate training and to have a small amount of money during the period of training, and they offer the real place and train conditions. There are about 20 activities like running a hotel, running a restaurant, service offices. Help me, Vincenzo. Anyway, 20 different activities are. So the move was from work therapy to real work, of course, and these are social enterprises which are active in the open labor market, which is very important. Networking with the community is important. We start with the energies and resources which are in direct contact with the service. So that means providing meetings with the clients and the families because they are using the services, and then raising to this networking to the community at large. that is also important. But starting from within, not just an addendum from the outside. And this connection is a two-way. It's very important for creating a community service which is effective. This is called parallel empowerment. The empowerment of the staff, because they are responsible, they are more than case managers, because the team is providing this kind of holistic care. And so I think the level of satisfaction is rather high, and support by the group is very important as compared to individual case management, for instance, which also, well, there are key workers, there are some that we don't have time to describe in details. But also, of course, it's an empowerment of client and family at the same time. And the relationship between the client and the professionals is redefined in this more open, let's say parallel two-way development, which includes both. There are some outcomes of research. I don't want to be short with it. Of course, it's dramatic, the savings as compared to psychiatric hospital. 37% is the calculation of the overall cost of all the services, including housing provided to people in Trieste for 5,000 people every year, as compared to 1,000 were in psychiatric hospital. So it's 37%. So 1/3 of the cost of the psychiatric hospital today, projected in today costs. And the stuff is, well, going to human rights very quickly. I don't know if of course, having said that, of course, we are talking about the issue of coercion, and you know, Martin already mentioned all the documents of the WHO, well analyzed reasons why violence, coercion, and abuse occur in a mental health facility, like staff beliefs, power dynamics, insufficient training, lack of supervision, etc., cultural things, etc. And there are some technical strategies to address. Some are described, de-escalation techniques, but sensory approaches, comfort rooms, and well, they are all fine. But our point is, do we need alternatives, or do we need to change the system? So that's point for me, the key point. So these are alternatives that they are fine, they are nice because the client can choose, but we would like to be a little bit more ambitious, try to change the overall system if possible, or move toward that direction. And so reduce coercive intervention in routine clinical practice as an overall aim that you can declare. You can also organize management by objectives and have productivity paid for the professionals if you satisfy that one. This has happened. So the culture and ethos of the organization is very important. So this must be changed, and the practice must declare that this is possible. The WHO guidance. Okay, we talk about the importance of freedom as a first choice. So freedom first is a precondition of care. This is the title of a very nice research done by the Trimbos Institute of the Netherlands some years ago. They issued a book after staying with us for a while, researching on turf, and they also identified three main aspects: the holistic approach, so the individual seen holistically in his social context, needs and rights, etc. The ecological approach, that means including all this element of the social network, community, social capital, as one of the assets of care, and of course the other aspect that is well, doesn't work. Okay, again. I don't know why. Okay, and the legal approach then is regarding the rights, the civil rights of the individual, but also the social rights as they are connected. So we can move toward this no restraint general framework, which creates a completely different situation. If we are capable to open a negotiation where the other is ideally is becoming a peer in the negotiation, not this dramatic gradient of power must be reduced a lot, and this is very important to do that, to have the open door. It's a material aspect, but it's so important. So having the door open means that the client can say bye-bye, and you have to go and search for him and find another solution before applying involuntary care that in Italian law is the last resort. So you must oblige to do that. So that means that you have to negotiate. The co-responsibility is another concept. Working with a social network means to have the family and the friends and all the significant others involved in the negotiation. This is something different. I cannot equalize to support the decision making, but this to some aspect it is. That means the others have a say and also have an they are interlocutors to the service, etc. And the open door choice can have impact on the three aspects, because the ethical choice having no restraint in open door created low rate of accident and offense and low rate of compulsion in voluntary treatments. These are numbers. We were calculated into the healthcare services in Trieste having the lowest number of accidents some years ago, including general medicine, which is significant. That means that quality of relationship are being nurtured in a good way. Experience of care means also having more humane negotiations, developing alternative ways to manage a crisis, attention to welcoming services. So people are welcomed in the service. You must develop an attitude to do that, etc. Yeah, and so these are things that are working that I mentioned before. I don't know to go furthermore. Yeah, so to summarize and to simplify, we can talk about a shift from hospitalization with the rigidity of rules toward hospitality. That is the concept of being hosted in a mental health center, in a community bed, and where you are really a guest, and people are there to serve you, to listen to you, to help you to go through the crisis, and sometimes to negotiate, and sometimes to discuss with you, to have some confrontation if needed. That means a real relationship, or well, when there are risks for care and the person would like to abandon the treatment or to abandon the service, it's one of the duties of the staff to do it. In this way, you can avoid accident, violence, many things that we don't want that happen in the services, because you have agreed flexible rules. You mediate the time. For instance, the person can go out in a crisis, can be accompanied to his home. Sometimes we do that. To take his things or his radio, his computer, involve the family, etc., and the friends. Usually in the crisis, we have a simplification of the experience. We look at the crisis, medicalization is the dominating paradigm we use. And so very often crisis, which is a personal event, is turned into an emergency, which is a medical definition with an acute presentation shaped by the systems that we adopt to treat acute care. So traumatic referral pathway, of course, restraint, etc., and scholarship care. So we decided not to use the general hospital as first choice. It's just a place where the user that come at night can be hosted for the night, and then the following day, the mental health center team comes and comes in contact with the person to develop the program. So having just a quick bypass as soon as possible, not a place for involuntary hospitalization. They happen also in the community mental health center with the open door, expanding the idea that, as I said, this is not detention. It's just trying to, provide obligation to medication, but basically, and other things that can be, of course, prescribed. Some social prescribing too, etc. So if the person leaves the center, you can recontract, of course. You can host the family somehow with the patient. Yeah. So we can say negotiating reasons, listening to reasons coming from the client, from the family, etc. Even in difficult situation. This requires to maintain the social system, so having the system involved, family involved, and mobilizing all the resources, human resources of the institution and the service. Yeah. So the data show the reduction. These are the reduction, the red line, reduction of use of community mental health center beds even. So we don't need to have so many now, because it's if you approach in this way, you can also reduce the need to have a person hosted in the mental health center. the comparison of the blue line is the number of nights in the mental health center, and the orange line is the nights in the general hospital unit. So that's the imbalance you can see. So we don't need too many general hospital beds at the end of the day. And we did also research in several services in Italy some years ago, where we see that determinants of quick crisis resolution are wide range of community intervention, and very important, an established trusty relationship, which is a proxy of a good outcome. That's very important. Nobody teach in psychiatry how to do it, but that's a very important key point, developing a trusty relationship. And hospitalization, it doesn't depend on severity as compared to the mental health center. The hospitalization is linked to a channel that goes through emergency to I&E, etc. And this is also associated with a higher dosage of medication and restraint. As we said, working this way, as you heard from Martin, the rate of involuntary treatment in Italy anyway, in general, not in Trieste, decreased, and currently is 14 per 100,000 population. These are the national data, which for me is impressive. That means that the need for compulsory care is decreasing, even if the quality of service is uneven, is very patchy in Italy. But this is very important. The law is very helpful in that, but not only, just also, as I said, the culture. We were able not to avoid involuntary treatment personally for 3 years in one mental health center. You can do that. You can work and trying to find other solutions using the community meetings, the staff meetings to find creative solutions to approach the person in different ways, etc. And also the nights and the acute service are, I stop here and I say that, of course, as we said, a rationale to apply this starts with the overall aim was not just closing asylums. Today, we have very many forms of forced treatment that are happening in forensic, and you have the secure beds in this country, and other countries have other forms of institutional solutions. So avoiding terrible experiences to people when they are in crisis, particularly. So values are important. Yesterday, we talked a lot about citizenship. Today, we focus on human rights, social integration with all of the previous client, the mental hospital. Now we talk about addressing social determinants of health, which are also important. And principles must be translated into practices, and particularly in the quality of a human relationship. So freedom is therapeutic. Thank you.
Hi there, my name's Phil Baker. I'm a psychiatrist and a medical director here in East London. And thank you very much for all of your talks. I've got a question about politics, if that's okay. And perhaps it might be for all of you. Certainly I'm interested in the Scottish and the Italian, German experiences. So we have quite a depressing history, I think, in England of basing health policy on when individual adverse events happen. So something bad happens and then there's a knee-jerk reaction and a whole load of policy comes from it, and we develop our systems around that. Now, however good your systems are in Italy, or what you develop in Germany and Scotland as well, you will still have adverse incidents, and you will have people with psychosis who kill people, or you'll have people who die by suicide. And I'm very persuaded by a lot of what you say, but what I worry about here is that you could have a single adverse incident, which then leads to a very knee-jerk reaction. The politics of England, I think, would mean that something must be done, and that something is common sense. It's lock people up again. How have you managed the politics of this, really? And then a slightly additional question, which is, a lot of what you developed in Trieste seems to be based on legal changes that happened in the 1970s and 80s, which were across Italy. And I'm wondering, is the model that you've got in Trieste replicated across Italy? Is it replicated in big cities? Or is it a very Trieste-specific model? I hope that was clear.
Yes, well, it's a very complex question, of course, but recently we had, the situation in Italy is not ideal at the moment. There are cuts in services, and for about more than 10 years so far, there is probably more than 20% of staff which is lacking, and investment are going down. So now we have less than 3% of the healthcare expenditure for mental health, 3%. Like we are close to Nigeria now, with respect. So, okay, that means in this context, of course, there is a resurgent request for putting people into psychiatry as the last resort, particularly those who are difficult to manage in jails or anywhere. So, and the user and which are not satisfied by the use of some forensic small units we have now called the REMS, Residential Unit for Execution of Security Measures, which are 20 beds, limited number of beds anyway. So that there is a public debate, and usually the debate is about what is pertaining to psychiatry and what is not pertaining to psychiatry. And I think that this is an open debate, of course. And but as I said in the beginning, and sorry for the passion, is that really the movement and the law 180 in 1970 broke this idea that psychiatry is the servant of public order. So that's and this is reflected by many other acts and laws that happened afterwards. Last one was the one on forensic, for instance, where even if you keep someone without their will for a longer period of time in a small forensic unit, you don't have the obligation to control that this goes out or not, because it's so-called the perimetral control must be done by the social, well, the police, etc. And if the person escaped, doesn't mean the police is there, but you have to call the police and say. So this complete split between the therapeutic role and the social aspects of the public order is clear. Even it's debatable, because this can lead to a disengagement from care by some services. They can say, well, it's not mine, so it's just he's a criminal, typical definition, black or white definition. We know that we must take care of people into jail, into forensic care, in all the aspects, and looking particularly at people who are in vulnerable social conditions. So disengaging psychiatry is not the choice, is not the solution, but being clear that we don't want and we don't have the obligation, at least in our country, to run locked places, to run places where psychiatry is limited to control people's behavior. This is very clear. Probably it's an advantage of the history we had and the condition. But I think it can be done. I think we must. You have a country where there is a public debate on the quality of services, and service users have a voice, and families also they require more humane care, more open care. So I think it's time probably to question why psychiatry is put with the shoulder on the wall in this role. Please.
Okay, hello there. Excuse me. My name is Peter Hughes. I'm a global psychiatrist, I guess. Working. So I'm working mainly at the moment in the post-Soviet states. I'm working with WHO. I also work quite a bit in WHO headquarters. So I know the CRPD office and Michel Funk, and we have had discussions about how, as a UK psychiatrist as well, how it can be very difficult for us to put CRPD into context in the UK. But I also just was reflecting on the mention of human rights approach. So when I'm working in the different countries I go to, including Afghanistan, I'll talk about confidentiality, deinstitutionalization, respect for people, treating people with dignity, also about enhancing protection of adults, children. So particularly this was a big issue in Afghanistan, human rights of women. So the other thing that I just mentioned is I'm sometimes asked, what have I learned from working with human rights as a psychiatrist back in the UK? And it's not the big things, because I think these issues you bring up are so big, but it's the small things like treating people with respect and dignity, not forcing people to take medication if they don't wish to in a community setting, but having that dialogue really becomes very important. I've learned from working in East London, when I had much longer time with people of an hour sometimes, that you can do a lot in an hour and persuade people about medication. So I think also just to be, if you are doing something that isn't CLPD compliant, you just think about it and reflect on it.
Thank you, guys. I'm Ferdinand Jonsson. I'm an Icelandic psychiatrist in East London, and I work in Tower Hamlets. My worry, I think it's great talks, and it's great to have a vision, and it's very important that we treat our patient with respect and dignity and with according to human rights as much as we can, and it's challenging. My worry is, though, that, you know, we might go too far, and I've looked after, I worked here for 16 years. I've looked after patients from Italy, and I've seen families from Italy who have had quite unwell patients who were sort of traveling all over Europe and have never been treated properly. And that was really painful to do you know what I mean? The other side of it, these horrible illnesses that are so discriminatory, and people, you know, they are somehow, you know, they need to be treated somehow. You feel that, you know, you can go to the streets of New York and Philadelphia, and there's freedom, really important, but the streets are full of really unwell people, and that's very unfair. And, you know, that's discrimination in my books. And also, there's something about, my friend is now working in Frankfurt and looking at the institutions there, and there's a huge difference between the public ones and the private ones. And, you know, there's also history lies heavily on all of us, because psychiatry has a very dark history, and, you know, some countries, incredibly dark history. So there's something about, it's really, I guess, difficult, but I think we have to be critical in our thinking. When are we going too far? You know, where's the some line, and the line must be moving. Does that make any sense? So do you want it in Icelandic?
I think you can probably hear me with that micro, which is on. I suppose sometimes when I give talks like these, I come across as pretty radical or passionate about it, which is all true. But at the same time, I'm in charge of a service. And so what I'm advocating here is a radical shift, and what I do day to day is the piecemeal change, and even that creates a response. And probably will relate to the previous question briefly, if I may. And of course, incidents happen. And of course, when I started this new job in Bremen a couple of years ago, people were expecting all sorts of things or fearing all sorts of things. Oh, now detention will stop. It did not stop, but it did reduce. And so, and then people started complaining, who were used to the other system. And so then the complaints were raised with the health regulator. So the health regulator did investigations of just going through 16 complaints by actually legal guardians who just didn't like what we were doing. And all those 16 complaints were found to be unfounded, but a few issues of not ideal communication as things happen. But there's nothing in it that would sort of suggest it was unsafe care or unresponsible care being provided. Yet that was picked up by newspapers, and a newspaper put this lovely thing, some people fall out of the cuckoo's nest, was the title. And so it's kind of quite a catchy way of dealing with, but I think these are discussions that you have to have. And what my point is perhaps here is, you need to want to change it, to actually change it. Otherwise, the system will gravitate. And I've observed that here, I've observed it in Germany, I hear it from Frankfurt. The state funded psychiatry gravitates towards institutional care and more coercion. And unless we want that, we really engage in turning that around, it will just follow this gravitational process. And I mean, incidents happen in the system that we have now. So my question to you is, would it be worth to actually really change the system towards Trieste or even more radical, like the abolitionist position that mental health acts have to go? Some of those people who are researching that are actually in the video call. And from the other side of the planet, from Victoria, hi there. And so I suppose the question is whether we resign to the situation as it is and hope this doesn't get worse, or whether we say, no, that's the way this is going is not good.
The answer is, there are lots of young communicators here on me, and so I really respect what I do, and I try to do my best. But I think one has to be careful and critical on that approach, because we are not perfect, we are not gods. We do things, there are terrible things that happen on that journey, and you don't want to discriminate people who have a terrible illness, and that's not their fault. That's not their family fault. There's nobody's fault. But then a lot of them can be helped, and anti-psychiatry is rife in this world, and we live with that as well.
I would like to take the next question.
Hi, thank you. Richard Pyler, Registrar in Psychiatry. Fabian, you mentioned the idea of democratization of decisions around involuntary treatment. I guess in reference to what Dr. Baker mentioned, there can often be knee-jerk reactions politically, but also with the wider public. If there is an adverse event, like a homicide, perhaps by someone with schizophrenia, there's often a lot of outrage and actually calls for greater use of coercive control. And so I wonder what form democratization would take, would it involve the wider public, and is there a risk, in fact, that might backfire and we might see a greater degree of coercive control as a result?
Thank you. Yeah, okay. So 2 points, I guess. No, let's say make 3 points. The main point I was making was a structural procedural one. That insofar as these, we want to avoid arbitrary interference, we need to provide equal basis for people on which they are treated. And that will mean that we change our practices quite fundamentally. And that will have to mean that some of these decisions are taken out of the medical remit and come into the social remit. That's just a procedural point. If there are social matters, the society should decide about. And then come you, and your first question was similar. Well, but society might make terrible decisions about it, partly because they might be governed by just individual cases and by a particular kind of heated, media-fueled sort of discussion environment. And yes, I'm worried about that, very much. But it seems to me it's first of all just a procedural point. If it's a social matter, then we anyway making a social decision about it, and it would be better to make it more transparent and more democratic. Then we need to think about how can we make, as a society, even our social decisions more democratic and more transparent. And that will involve all sorts of things. We need to think about how our media functions. We need to think about that democracy isn't just about what immediately comes over us as a preference, but has to involve the right sort of deliberative forum. And there, for example, to make it a bit more concrete, I can see that experts by experience should have to have a much bigger role in educating us in the way you were saying about what it is like to experience these sort of conditions and what it is like to go through the institutional settings we had. So one way in which you counter specific examples is to give specific examples on the other side. And you give and you say, look, politics is always going to be coarse-grained. So whatever we do, some people will either be more detained than we would otherwise be, or not enough detained than they always be. And so we need to have social, wider, democratic, transparent decision about that, informed by people who actually have lived that. So partly you tell concrete stories about the other side. I guess linking sort of the various points here, the third point is, I think partly what I was just trying to be a messenger about is there's a fundamental shift in how we regulating care. One way in which I tell that story is, you all probably as doctors swear a kind of oath in some form. And the way to think about that is the oaths have changed over the millennia. There used to be an oath, not the Hippocratic oath, but a different oath, particularly in the Jewish medical tradition, which was, I should see my patient solely as a creature in pain. So that was really patient. It was a very, very important idea here. They're not active, they're just suffering. And my role as a doctor is, I need to provide care for them. Mm-hmm. Now, I think what has changed is now we need our social, cultural things have changed so that we now need to think of people not just a creature in pain, but as a citizens with right. And that raises all sorts of problems that if they're citizens with right, they might refuse things which is in their best interest, and that might lead to bad outcomes. Yes, back to Antigone and tragedy. But I think that's a big shift. They are not just creatures in pain, they're citizens with rights. And that's a fundamentally different thing. We need to still provide care for them, but see them as persons with rights. And I think that's the big difference about the CRPD. If we had more time, I would talk a little bit more about that. The thing which is different with the CRPD, with the UN idea, is that not just people have rights, that's important, but when people need to be safeguarded, the human rights revolution here is they have to have a sort of second order say about what safeguards apply to them. Not just what rights they have, but what we can do about safeguarding them. Even that second order, their will and preferences has to be consulted. That's the key difference now. That's why we're not just creatures in pain, but citizens with rights. And sometimes we need to safeguard them, but under new human rights regulation, we need to safeguard them in a way which is negotiation with them as citizens. That's different.
Can I take that to a concrete level of a question that we have here in the chat? Catherine Hollins, I'm interested in how you would talk about the experience of having an open door for a person who is saying that they're going off to take their own life. What is your responsibility as a clinician to this person and to the staff who opens the door, having heard this plan?
You're washing your hands.
No, I'm not washing my hands. It's a question about actual practice. So I'm happy to say more about it too.
No, that's actually outlined quite well in the 21 guidance about the Heidenheim model. So people who are suicidal go on an open ward. They go into one-to-one and not one-to-one observation, into one-to-one counseling with the most experienced nurse on that particular ward. And they go into one-to-one as long as it takes. And the doctors see them every day, the psychologists see them every day. And so people sort of take turns in looking after this person. And so everything is negotiated. So that's the answer to the suicidality, because you can kill yourself on a psychiatric ward just as well as out there in the community. And so it actually makes little difference whether you are on a ward or in the community, if you are suicide, the therapeutic relationship, the trust. And that's, I think it's actually a good example for a situation where will and preferences point in different directions. Because obviously that person wants to kill herself. So her will is, I want to die. Yet, until just a few moments ago, the preferences were to stay alive. Otherwise, she wouldn't be here anymore, would she? So here, will and preferences point in different directions. And that's where I think we come in as the specialists, and we need to do much better on that. But the starting point is for the most experienced person in the team to start looking after this particular individual.
There's a question for you, Roberto. In Italy, after the reform over time, was there any difference in completed suicide rates? And if known, numbers of suicide attempts too? One would be interested in homicide rate too, if known.
Okay. The date of the suicide rate in Italy is one of the lowest in Europe, and Trieste was strange from this point because Trieste was influenced by the Middle European country, being part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So historically, Trieste had one of the highest, the second in Italy, but before and also after the law. So this does regard very much the law, the reform law. It started from 25th cases per 100,000 population, which is very high. If you consider that some years ago we had the record by Lithuania, it was 50. So I think it was high. Now it's, well, after a number of years, but I don't think it's our merit. Because of probably societal changes, you know that across the world, suicide rate is going down generally, very much, particularly in northern European countries, very much. And Denmark is a case of it. But in Trieste, we now have about 12, 13 cases for 100,000. So it's the half of what we had in the 90s. When we started with a specific program, which encompassed the hotline, immediate help, meeting in the place of choice for counseling, etc., etc. But I don't think, well, this made some difference probably for schoolwork and education in schools, etc. But I mean, societal parameters are much more important. I think we have to abandon the idea that the suicide rate and homicide rate are the product of psychiatry. It's too simplistic. Sorry, no one in sociology can support that. But on the other hand, well, if you are interested, Italy has a decreasing homicide rate for the well, despite things that can happen, of course. And this is another change in the society. I don't think has much to do with our. What we discover in that suicide prevention program that we set up, that only 1/4 and 1/3 of those who were suicidal were already known by the service, which is shocking for me anyway. So we need to outreach more people at risk of suicide.
Any other questions? Last one, please.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentations. Actually, I recently moved to UK from Turkey, so I had an experience in Turkey with community mental health system.
Okay.
It was recently in our country, like 15 years. So maybe I would like to share a little bit of my experience, and I would like to ask a question, direct a question towards you from the social and political. In my country, where I come from, there's like still some institutions, but less beds than Europe. So institutions need to work at the moment. The institutions apply sometimes very high restriction orders or high amounts of medication. So when I come here or see hospitals in US, for example, much lower doses can be applied, and the cutoff recovery can be very different according to an institution, even in one country. This is what my experience is. I don't know what you think about this. So defining recovery or remission can be different with different clinicians or even within different institutions and countries. So after the community mental health system, I realized that in private hospitals and practice, the numbers of patients, especially schizophrenia and bipolar patients, serious mental health issues, the rates are highly decreased, and the revolving door phenomenon seems to really decrease among these patients. In our practice, it is very obvious, actually. The second thing is, I think there's a binary point of view from the side of the patient and the community, because if the patients are out, what could happen to the community? Does that impose a risk factor or not? So among these conversations, I was like trying to hear, so what happens to the public and what happens to the community? So I was wondering at the time in Italy, when this reform was ongoing, what were the factors affecting the public opinion to support the patients to be free at the time? And what were the accessibility options? Because I think this sounds also important. In case of US, for example, if patient cannot go somewhere else, and if not institutionalized, so there will be many people out there cannot find and nothing can be accessible, and also lacking this right to be treated as well. I don't know if it's clear.
Oh, well, just one, I agree. Well, it's very interesting what you said, but the issue of community involvement of the community that I raised in my presentation, I tried to underline the importance of having, starting from the family, but the local community involved as much as possible. Of course, in the beginning, there were oppositions when we start to open hospitals, and of course there was, but very soon, for instance, currently, what saved the Italian reform across 40 plus years was the position taken by the Association of Family Members in favor of the improvement of services and not the regression to the previous situation. And this was something that very soon happened very soon, about 4 or 5 years after the law, after the initial resistances, etc. There were a couple of national association with few people that were completely against, but the other were supportive, and now there is a great support of family members. So when there is some risk for reform, we call them, and they are really representing the public. And this is very important, having the families on board and not creating an opposition between those who use the services, called users and families, and those who provide services. We are all on the same ship. We are navigating. If we enter into a reform process, you have to do it with people, not against people. That's definitely, and this is the experience. Of course, there are exceptions, because, as I said before, and the friend colleague said before, the quality of services in our country is very uneven, but I think as in many countries, and there are terrible services somehow. And, not because they don't treat people, they treat people with the reductionist, with the biomedical model, provide the medication and that's it, etc. So that's the level. For mental health, we need much more.
Right, thank you very much to all our speakers. I would like to mention before you go that we had a small group of clinicians going to Trieste in May. And we can confirm, we saw it with our own eyes. It is happening there. And we have a small working group at Delft. Anybody who's interested in pursuing really a discussion to see to what extent can these models be brought into play for service development in East London, please contact myself, Shiraz Ahmed, or Becky Lingard. I wish you a lovely afternoon until we do go to the pub as usual, yes. Actually, one announcement, as it looks like the October Barts can't happen because there is a junior doctor and a consultant strike during that week. So I think we will have to postpone that. Thank you very much to everyone.